Hey everybody, Michael Tracey here. So this one is a doozy. Matt Taibbi and I had an epic, I would say, discussion about the implosion of Russiagate, the ensuing media fallout, etc. This conversation took place on Saturday, March 30th. Taibbi obviously needs no introduction whatsoever, so let's just get into it. All right. Hey Matt.
Hey, Michael.
How are you? We're just still laughing because it's such an incredible sequence of events that has led to this day, and it is amusing in a way. It's like dark and insidious, but also there's some humor in it. So
It's funny. It's stressful.
Yeah.
It's been a stressful 33 months.
Yeah.
Right. That's how long it's been, right? If you go back to the Franklin Foyer thing, you should say that's the beginning of it.
You could predate it actually to June of 2016 when the first report came out in the Washington Post, which alleged that the DNC had been infiltrated by Russian state actors based on the CrowdStrike report. Remember that?
Right. Yeah. I didn't really I didn't really care about that story that much.
Right.
But
I'm just saying that's where you could pinpoint the origin.
Yeah, it's about that long.
Yeah. A long ass time. How about that?
It has been a long time, and it's been stressful. We were talking about this. You were saying this is the most intense week of your life, your journalism life. I would say it's more for me. Just this one story has been more of a bummer overall for the last couple of years than any other thing that I've ever had to deal with, for sure.
Yeah, because I became very closely associated with the story such that I came to be understood as like a chief Russiagate skepticism correspondent at the various places that I've worked. And it was never a conscious choice. It was just I had this instinctual aversion to the story, and it just never seemed right.
Right.
So even if I wanted to focus on other stuff, I always was pulled back in to this sprawling story that always seemed to gain new dimensions and always grew and kind of morphed into different areas. So, I feel like, anyway.
No, that's absolutely true. This thing took up so much oxygen that I think a lot of us tried to make the conscious decision at various times to just kind of stay out of it, and
it never worked.
And it never worked. You just couldn't because it was everywhere. Like the story dominated almost all news coverage, and it was impossible really to cover anything else and have anybody pay any attention to it either. And that was another problem.
That's why it's amazing that there's kind of this post hoc rationalization game going on where people are now saying, oh, it was never a big story. You guys who are the skeptics, you exaggerated its importance. You're more obsessed with it than the people who are pushing it.
Right, yeah, and that's been one of the talking points this weekend, which is nuts because if you turned on MSNBC at any time over the last 2 years, 95% of their broadcast was this story, and it was everywhere. The New York Times was doing 45-minute infographics to it, and it was constantly on the editorial pages of the Post and the Times, Saturday Night Live. It seems like every joke they did was Putin down the chimney or something like that.
Every time I was in a public place where I happened to just catch a glimpse of CNN blaring on a TV screen,
right.
Almost invariably, there was some Russia story that Wolf Blitzer was solemnly intoning about.
Cuomo. Yeah, exactly. It was, and they. I understood it from that point of view because from the commercial point of view, it's a great story especially for cable, just because it has that element of you have to keep tuning in because any minute now, like the thing could happen.
Yeah,
right?
All these subplots would emerge.
Right.
It's like a serial drama almost.
Yeah, oh yeah, totally, yeah.
Like the new characters would come up who were like colorful, like Roger Stone, and
right.
Flunkies like George Papadopoulos. It's ridiculous.
Right, it was like The Wire. You had Avon up here, but then later on you learn about Rock and Cheese and all these other people. Like the whole org chart of the story was it was interesting. If you got into it, it was fun. But that was kind of the problem, is that, it became a lot like the Alice's Restaurant thing with the 28:7 color glossy photos with the circles and arrows. Like, the people got way too into that aspect of it, the connecting the dots aspect.
My analogy is Hotel California, because you can check out anytime you want, but you can't never leave.
That's right. Yeah.
That's how I felt. Like, even when I wanted to focus on other issues,
Right.
even when I had like professional obligations to focus on other issues, you always felt this kind of gravitational pull back toward Russiagate as it was unfolding.
Right. Yeah. No, definitely. And yeah, the notion that that this was never that big of a story, and that it was blown out of proportion by a couple of people on cable. I mean, that was the
on
take.
Twitter, you mean?
Yeah, on Twitter and on cable. Like Wait,
but who are the people who have been on cable who have been saying that it was? Or did I misunderstand what you just said?
No. I mean, like, for instance, the Washington Post and Margaret Sullivan did this piece this week where she said, like, well, maybe there are a few people on cable.
Oh, right, gotcha.
They're not really journalists anyway. And
so they're scapegoating Rachel Maddow right now.
Yeah, exactly.
She's the sacrificial lamb.
Yeah.
No, wasn't just Rachel Maddow. I mean, she was the most egregious manifestation of it, arguably. Mm-hmm. But you also had just the New York Times, like the most mainstream organs of national media.
Right.
Were fixated on it. Everyone from the Atlantic to the Daily Beast to then the pinnacle of the profession, like the New York Times, Washington Post.
Yeah.
So the idea that it's, the excesses were confined to Rachel,
right,
is just a total rewriting of history.
Right, and the thing that was so conspicuous about the Times and the Post was their total absence of like countervailing investigation.
Right.
They didn't look at any aspect of the story except for the parts that they thought might have borne political fruit.
Or conform to their preordained anti-Trump narrative.
Right, yeah, exactly. I mean, you would have expected a little bit of, just on the due diligence front, checking out some other things.
Hey, let's check out the claims of these CIA officials.
Right, yeah.
It didn't occur to them?
Right, yeah. Well, I mean, they're, a couple of steps removed from being partners with the CIA, I guess, so that's tough for them, the Post, anyway.
Yeah. Well, I mean, MSNBC literally hired John Brennan.
Oh, I know.
I mean, he became a colleague of the people covering the story, and I know that there are multiple instances in which he was then, even while he was working for NBC, I can't prove this, but my strong suspicion is some of the former intelligence officials that were anonymously quoted were Brennan as he was employed
right.
by NBC Universal, or whatever the corporate organ is.
Right, yeah, no, that was a very strange ethical situation.
Yeah.
Because you had somebody who was unquestionably part of the story, right? I mean, by his own admission, by his own testimony, he was the originator of the investigation, and to have him kind of seamlessly turn into a public commentator on it,
right,
was totally bizarre. Like I don't know how they had to have put some kind of Surgeon General's warning on every report that he did, but they didn't do it.
And it didn't strike people as bizarre because he was a Trump foil.
Right.
He was providing a convenient purpose for the anti-Trump legions out there that predominate the media. So, the ethical questions that should inevitably arise around a situation like that, again, it just didn't occur to them.
Right.
Which is bizarre. I feel like if it was if the partisan circumstances were inverted and it was like a conservative network hiring a former official or something, it would have provoked a lot more.
Of course. Yeah. I mean, there were a few people, like Adam Johnson, who did point out some of these things, right? But for the most part, the ethical ramifications of a lot of these things were just not commented upon. And a lot of that is just because of the presumption that, just Trump is a completely unethical person. So
the worst possible thing about him must be correct.
Right, yeah.
He must have done the worst possible thing to assume power.
And let's not quibble over ethics when the person on the other side is the worst example of that.
Yeah, let's not busy ourselves with, factual fidelity to facts anymore.
Right.
They stopped caring about it.
Right. Yeah.
They stopped caring about verifying basic tenets of their stories.
Right.
I mean, you mentioned this in your Substack piece, but it's just amazing to go back the long, sordid history of just these instances where foundational norms, quote, and I hate that term now, but like the foundational norms that would have governed American journalistic practice prior to like 2016 just went out the window.
Right. Right. And, you know, all of the things that the little weaknesses in the system that we have, you know, we've always been very susceptible to stories that have unnamed government officials as sources.
Right.
Right. That's always been a problem. It was a problem in the WMD episode. This whole idea of oppo research and how and all the different ways you can get it into, you know, one of the things that happens in Washington, which is a real problem, is that there's all these sort of interlocking relationships between people. Like lawyers are married to lobbyists, who are married to politicians, who are friends with journalists, who are friends with aides on the Hill, who are friends with people who work at firms like Fusion GPS. So all those, so it becomes very relationship driven. And so if you have an opposition research document, if you have something you want, a tidbit you want to get in to the media, sometimes the relationship can trump the sort of factual journalistic aspect of it.
Because you feel like you have a professional or social obligation to those people.
Yeah, exactly. Or you know, if you have a strictly journalistic relationship with somebody, typically that's the place where you feel most comfortable with the stuff that's in print, because like your sources aren't going to burn, you know, somebody they've been working with for 20 years. But if it's, you know, I've got a friend who works for an oppo research company, and I've got another friend who works for a newspaper, you know, that's when it gets complicated. You know?
Yeah, we all hung out at a cocktail party 6 months ago or whatever. Right,
because it was an open secret that this Steele report was sort of kicking around Washington. You know, I first heard about it in, I don't know, September maybe of 2016. You know, and I know there were people who were chasing different parts of that story that may or may not have been connected to Steele before that even. But, you know, so everybody had a piece of this, and they were trying to find a way to get it printed, but they just couldn't do it. And it wasn't until they got to David Corn and Mother Jones that they found a way to get it in.
Yeah, and you know, David Corn, who I've described as the reporter who was most responsible for injecting the Steele dossier into the American media bloodstream, he is now on this kind of, he's now saying that, you know, he was nothing that went wrong, essentially. Don't believe these findings. He's basically, quote, gaslighting everybody, even though he was on MSNBC the day after Mueller's finding and essentially conceded that the Steele dossier was a fraud.
Right, he had to, because he was sitting there with Isikoff.
Right, Isikoff was much more forthright. Like David Corn was had to painfully kind of acquiesce to parts of what Isikoff was saying.
Right, and you know, I talked to David after the first Steele story, because at the time I was just interested in it, and I thought, you know, he was actually quite careful with that story. Well, not quite. He was careful, right? Because the rule basically says that you have to have some kind of legitimate journalistic reason to do the story. And the reason in that story was this idea that the FBI had taken possession of the report and was investigating aspects of it, and that they were calling this person credible.
So you're reporting the fact that the FBI had possession of it, not that the substantive allegations necessarily have been verified or have merit.
Right, and you know, you can do that. Yeah. Right. I mean, you can argue about the whole question of, because he put in words like blackmail, right? So, you know, if you're in his position, do you feel? I mean, I sympathize with the position that he was in. I mean,
I don't.
I mean,
just because I feel like he's been proven to be a fraud. I mean, let's just be honest. So I think, or the way that he's behaving now smacks of fraudulence. So I'm not inclined to have any sympathy with how he handled any aspect of this.
I'm trying to be generous, well, yeah. and I think with David, I'm guessing that a lot of this is he just so believes that Donald Trump is the worst thing ever, right. that it justified this. My counter argument to that would be, this is the biggest gift you could ever possibly give the guy. If that's your take,
that's what's so insane, right?
Yeah.
And I know you've had this experience, but all throughout this ordeal, every single day, literally, you get accused, or I got accused of being a Trump defender, apologist, etc. And now the grand ironic twist is that the people who were pushing this gave him the biggest gift in the world.
Of course. And this is
because now he has legitimate grounds to claim vindication.
Right.
Like he was proven right in a lot of ways, as difficult as that is for people to admit.
Yeah, no, look, when the Mueller report comes out, there's going to be stuff in there that's going to be embarrassing.
Sure.
Almost guaranteed there are going to be some pretty, brutal talking points in there that the Democrats are going to run on, going into 2020. But the overall grand thing, the lack of indictments on this particular issue, he can just put Rachel Maddow, or do one of those mashups about the walls are closing in or collusion or whatever it is, and that's going to be his ad for 2020.
Yeah.
He's basically going to be able to argue that the mainstream media, I'm using air quotes there, I hate people who do that, but he's going to be able to argue that we so disrespected the democratic choices of Trump's voters that we cooked up a fake story to try to get him out of office prematurely, and it's going to be hard to counter that argument. It just will.
It's because it's fundamentally correct.
Right. You saw Chris Matthews on TV the other day saying, "Well, I guess we have to win the election now." That was brutal.
Plan B.
Right. Yeah. It's just. I think people lost touch with how bad it looks, for if you're not a Trump hater, right? Mm-hmm. And you have to at least put yourself in the shoes of somebody who thinks differently. It just looked so incredibly bad, and the open rooting and all that stuff. It just reminded you of the worst excesses of Fox.
Yeah. You mentioned David Corn. Obviously, he's like the flagship Washington correspondent or whatever his exact role is for Mother Jones. And I just have to pay specific mind to the utter failings of, quote, progressive media or liberal media. And when I say liberal media, I don't mean what conservatives say liberal media is, so like NPR or something. I mean the avowedly ideologically progressive media. So Mother Jones, the Young Turks where I previously worked, just member parts of this media ecosystem that are supposed to be, skeptical of, militaristic, belligerent narratives.
Right.
Instinctually.
Right. Who
completely missed this story, and not just missed it, but actually egged on its worst elements. It's such a damning indictment of people that, you and I previously would have considered colleagues and friends and people who were on the same board, on the same page with.
Right.
And something about this story just totally disrupted.
Oh yeah, you heard stories about uprisings within all these different shops.
Yeah.
In some places it was more open than others. The Nation obviously had an issue.
There was an internal rebellion within the Nation because of Stephen Cohen.
Yeah.
And his wife Katrina, countenancing,
the VIPs.
God forbid.
Yeah.
Not just that, but countenancing Stephen Cohen repeatedly putting forth a unorthodox take.
Right. Yeah.
Because they thought it was helping Trump, and they were giving Trump legitimacy by having it come from a non-Trump supporting source.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. The Intercept had more than a few foibles during this time.
And I was telling you off air, and I'm happy to tell you about it now. It was the same with the Young Turks.
Mm-hmm.
I got automatically designated somehow, this chief Russiagate correspondent, chief Russiagate skepticism correspondent. Again, not because I ever made the choice to consciously become that, but because I was just so fundamentally annoyed. Something deep in my bones really angered me about the story from the beginning. So try as I might to, again, focus on anything else, it was never successful. But there was a lot of tension because they thought that, you're using our progressive platform to excuse Trump's crimes or something.
Right. Yeah.
And
exactly.
It was unforgivable for some of them. But I would always like to make the point, no, you are actually doing what's ultimately going to benefit Trump. You don't believe me right now, but wait.
Right.
So
right.
Cenk, in a clip that's not circulating around the internet, I forgot about, he goes on this rant when I wasn't even there. I was employed by the Young Turks, but he was on this panel, and he calls me out by name, his employee, and says, one of the people who has blinders on is Michael Tracey. I like him. I guess he's somewhat intelligent, but he's totally missed the boat on this Trump-Russia story, and I'll get the last laugh once Trump is taken out of the White House in handcuffs. That's literally what he said.
Right.
But, that was just the tip of the iceberg in terms of all the tension that had been incubating around this for a long time, and it wasn't pleasant.
Right. Yeah, no, it really wasn't. I think, we all felt it. I had my own experiences. For the most part, I had my editors were supportive. I did publish things about this, not in the magazine so much, but they never told me not to. But it was just an uncomfortable place to be. Like, you knew that if you mentioned it at all on social media or anything like that, that it would have this instantaneous reaction. And I don't know. It was strange. Like, and I didn't even care about the political aspect. People kept arguing about, this is going to hurt Trump, help Trump. Like, it just bothered me on a much more fundamental level.
Right.
Like, this is what I do for a living. Like, if we're going to be doing fake stories, or if we can't work it out at least, then I'm going to be out of a job soon. This isn't what I do. I was really worried about that. I'm still worried about that because, there's still not a lot of appetite to go back and really ask. I think that was one of the things that really, really troubled me about this from the beginning was a story would come out in one of these outlets, one of the big main outlets like the Post or the Times. It would get screwed up. And they wouldn't do the autopsy. It would be done by like Chuck Ross.
Yeah. Who did a lot of great work, actually.
Yeah, who's
at the Daily Caller.
At the Daily Caller. Chuck Ross has turned out to be a really excellent first-rate reporter.
He even broke stories that reflected poorly on Trump, like the Mike Flynn turkey stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And I think most people, I would disagree with him probably on all kinds of things, but
it doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. That's the whole point. Like when you're covering a story, like if it falls this way, you got to do it. If it falls that way, you got to do it. And he's done a lot of really good work. But that was a clear red flag that the autopsies weren't happening in the original places. You know what I'm saying? There were stories that got screwed up badly, and they just became tiny little italicized updates at best,
right?
At the bottom of stories, like the whole 17 agents.
Or sometimes they just wouldn't correct anything.
They wouldn't correct it.
They would deny that they were disproven.
Right. I mean, the story that worried me a lot from the beginning was the one about the repeated contacts with Russian intelligence. That was the New York Times story with the 4 sources, and it came out. I think it was on Valentine's Day of 2017, or the 15th maybe. And Comey later comes out and says that story in the main was not true. That story's still up there. It's not corrected. It's not updated. They didn't fix it. So it's Trump. That part of it was really worrying. We were speeding over all these seeming problems, and it didn't bother anybody in the business.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned your worry. I share that worry, and it's sort of paradoxical, right? Because ever since this Mueller finding came out, people have been giving our little Russia skeptic caucus accolades, including in the New York Times and Vanity Fair and respectable quote-unquote outlets. And yet it's also engendering a really, really intense backlash.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I haven't really heard the accolades at all. You'll have to show me where that.
Oh, okay,
they are.
okay.
Yeah.
I'll send them to you.
Okay, yeah.
I mean, there have been a couple. I mean,
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it seems like people are angrier than ever at us.
Right. Yeah. And, I think a lot of it has to do with this idea that people they get so emotionally invested in the Trump story that they really were genuinely emotionally let down by the idea that he wasn't going to be indicted or that his family members weren't going to be indicted, and
Jared Kushner was not going to spend the rest of his life in a dungeon somewhere or something, overseen by Mueller, whatever the fantasy was.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And, and so on that level, I understand that people are mad. I mean, but they don't. It's not my fault. that it didn't turn out to be true. So I think they should be mad at the people who manipulated them emotionally into expecting that. But whatever.
And we should say that I was being flippant when I called it the Russiagate Skeptics Caucus. It's just that's how we've been characterized, and that quote caucus never came about intentionally necessarily. It was just because over the course of this saga, we often had, you had the same instinctual reaction to the story, and it really felt like you were crazy at times. Like I almost at times felt like I had to step back and say, whoa, am I getting something so fundamentally wrong here that I'm totally blinded to it? Like, what is the deal? Am I having a mental breakdown? Like, it imposed that level of psychological stress at times where you didn't know if your reality had just been upended or something.
Right? Yeah, no, I wrote to you a couple of times, I remember, because I had that same reaction. I thought, am I losing my mind? Are my instincts that completely off? And it at times that was an incredibly stressful part of it. That was actually even worse than the whole question of, well, what will the professional consequences be for being wrong? That didn't even enter into it. The whole thought that my brain wasn't working well anymore, and that I could be this wrong about something, that really scared me to death, because that would mean I would no longer be able to do this job anymore, and I love this job, So it was tough. But I think we all went through that, except Glenn. Glenn doesn't. Glenn
he never second guessed himself for a second.
Yeah, exactly. But so when was? So you had right from the start. You thought it was.
Yeah, and this is another fascinating facet of all this, because you've mentioned that we still don't have a definitive timeline or trajectory as to how this story actually materialized.
Right.
But I can still vividly remember in July of 2016 seeing a narrative kind of coalesce, frankly, on Twitter, and then in parts of the online media, where like Josh Marshall at Talking Points Memo. I remember it was in late July, I want to say 23rd or 24th, something to that effect, when Josh Marshall put out a post saying, yes, the Trump-Putin relationship is real, or I'm paraphrasing, it was something along those lines. And he cited stuff like, the Republican platform had been changed, that became a 3-year talking point. Mm-hmm. He kind of intimated stuff about the business dealings, but he kind of wove it all together as some kind of coherent framework through which to understand this, quote, Russia thing.
Right.
And he kind of gave it order in a way that there hadn't been before.
Right.
And then, sure enough, we later learned that on July 31st is when the Crossfire Hurricane investigation was first launched.
Right.
So after the media had started putting together the pieces, the law enforcement apparatus seemingly reacted, which gets to this whole feedback loop where it almost seemed as though some of these security state officials were just reading the news. Yeah,
Maybe. We don't know, though.
Yeah, we don't know. That's the thing. That's what's so weird.
Because, there's multiple accounts there. So the one that the one that stood out to me was the one that was in Jane Mayer's piece, where she talked about, and Luke Harding, did the same article. But that was the one where
who you explicitly described in that Substack piece as like a horrible reporter.
Yeah.
Which is like, I said to myself, Matt doesn't usually go there, but he's obviously right.
No, I mean, that guy he's terrible. I don't like to, but anyway, the narrative that they put out, because they obviously were both told the same thing, was that Robert Hannigan from the GCHQ intercepted something, and the phrase they used for Jane Mayer was a stream of illicit communications that was so troubling that he had to fly to Washington and brief Brennan, right? Which is, I think, a little weird. I'm not sure about this, but why is he not briefing his counterpart at the NSA, right? Because I think that's their counterpart agency. But whatever, I'll have to check that. But anyway, he briefs Brennan at the CIA, who in turn later testifies that he had information about interactions and contact that inspired the FBI investigation. So my question is, what's in those intercepts? If that's the genesis of all this, what are they talking about? Are they talking about Papadopoulos? Are they talking about something else? Like, we need to know what that is.
And how precisely did that Brennan meeting come about? Like, how is it facilitated? What was the specific impetus? Which piece of evidence did he say, crossed the threshold where he would make the specific overture to Brennan? Right.
Yeah. I don't know. And what exactly troubled them so much? I mean, if it was the Papadopoulos thing, and it's just that, lunkhead talking about some drunken conversation. Well, he wasn't drunk, but whatever.
He was at a bar.
He was at a bar. I can't see that rising to the level of something that you would fly across the country. So
across the ocean, you mean?
Yeah, across the ocean. Yeah. See,
longer flight.
Yeah, but they've never told us that story. And then everything else about all this, there's been incredible detail. There's like 10,000 word stories about everything. But for some reason, the beginning of this is all completely fuzzy, and that was a huge red flag to me.
You know what occurs to me about you saying that just now, which is hilarious? So Lyndon LaRouche, who just died recently, his long-standing bonkers conspiracy theory was always that the British are conspirators to undermine the American Republic, and that's conspiracy.
Oh, right. Yes, exactly.
And they're always intervening to kind of destroy our institutions and ruin our economic standing and all kinds of bonkers stuff, right?
Right.
And he actually applied that analysis to this whole episode, when he was in his 90s or whatever, saying the British are at it again. I guess the Queen hates Trump or something, and dispatched this intelligence official. And you know what? It might be right. I don't know.
Yeah.
Not the LaRouche version, but this notion that it was instigated weirdly by some British intelligence official. It kind of, in a very bizarre way, vindicates Lyndon LaRouche's lifelong obsession.
Yeah, there's a version of that theory that is circulating in conservative media that the actual genesis of all this had to do with British concerns about Brexit, and that before we did, they saw that Trump could actually win the election, and were concerned about it. But I haven't seen anything that actually substantiates that.
Yeah,
but that's
because there's so much we don't know still.
Right, exactly. The point is there's nothing that we can really sink our teeth into that tells us what exactly started this whole thing. There have been, again, stories with questionable sourcing in all the mainstream papers saying, well, the beginning of this for the FBI was Papadopoulos, and there was another one they suggested that it began with Carter Page. But it's murky. It's not clear what the deal is there, and how can we know what to think about any of this until we know how it started?
And also hilariously, Lyndon LaRouche ended up getting cited in the Steele dossier, which should have been the ultimate tip-off that the Steele dossier was a complete joke.
Did he really? I don't even remember that.
Absolutely, you got to go back and look. He's referenced in the Steele dossier in one of these incremental monthly updates.
Wow.
Because like, as he's some kind of, some kind of saboteur or something like that the Russians would want to latch onto to kind of, throw American politics into disarray. And the other Lyndon LaRouche element, and I know it's weird that I'm like a Lyndon LaRouche expert.
Well, the Jonathan Chait thing. Yeah.
Is the Jonathan Chait thing, right?
Yeah.
That provided the source material for the infamous Jonathan Chait piece. That was the cover story of New York Magazine that said the relationship between Trump and Russia went back to 1987.
Right.
And of course, Chris Hayes famously hosted Jonathan Chait to expound on, the utter seriousness of that story when it was published.
Right. Which and that story drove me crazy on a number of levels. The main one being that, like, does no one notice that these are two different countries we're talking about? That was. I mean, I guess people think that the KGB sort of survived as the FSB later on. But,
and they say like Putin was a KGB agent, and once a KGB agent, always a KGB agent, which I guess must be true in some sense.
But he had a kind of a little bit of a career change in the middle of there, where he was basically like a bagman for a corrupt mayor in St. Petersburg.
No, good.
Yeah, I don't know, but the inability of people to tell the difference between the two countries drives me nuts. I mean, to this day, you can look on, I think it's Mother Jones, on Korn's page. They still have hammer and sickle graphics.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Like, and part of that is because they're drawing on the same sort of archaic fear of the Soviet Union that I guess some of the older audiences still have. But really, I mean, and the other thing that's important about that is that the Soviet Union was actually a much more serious geopolitical threat, and they were in a different way. Let's put it this way: like they
more formidable.
More formidable. They had a much more aggressive intelligence operation around the world. Like the modern Russian state is different. It's a kleptocracy. It's like a series of kind of feudal gangster interests. Mm-hmm. Whereas the Russian state was the Soviet state was sort of monolithic and organized, and it was totally plausible that one person who was a Russian, operating somewhere in the world like Natalia Veselnitskaya, it would have been much more plausible to say that person was an agent of the Soviet Union than now, when that person could just as easily be a third-rate gangster from like a Moscow suburb, which is what she looked like from the outside. So the inability to tell the difference between these things kind of drove people who had actually lived in Russia a little bit crazy.
By the way, did you see that Mother Jones is now putting out fundraising appeals where they're saying that the Mueller report might not have delivered, but David Corn still knows the truth. So give us money and we'll uncover the real truth. I swear to God. I'm paraphrasing, but that's the basic message. Wow. It's just like, wow, you are beyond shameless.
Yeah. Well, they placed a lot.
And I've written for Mother Jones. I mean, I used to write, regularly for Mother Jones before they transformed to whatever they are now. I don't know what they are now. There's something else.
Right. Yeah. No, they became very hyper aggressive about this. They had money come in, right?
Yeah.
To create this.
Yeah.
Specifically to find the evidence, basically, right? It was that was sort of the idea.
Yeah.
So that was odd. Like it wasn't like it was an open-ended inquiry to find out what this thing was.
Yeah.
None of that money went to finding out how this thing started.
And they were getting the money because the end goal was to take down Trump. Exactly. So they had a set objective.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
Which is obviously going to dictate the fact pattern that they establish.
Right.
And distort it.
Right. Which is not kind of what you're looking. As Bill Belichick would say, it's not what we're looking for. When it comes to journalism. But yeah, it was weird. It was very strange.
What does Bill Belichick say that in reference to? Like that wasn't the play we wanted to run or whatever?
Yeah, if somebody, if you have a fumbled snap on a punt or something like that, he'd say, well, obviously that's not what we're looking for.
Even Bill Belichick made a cameo in this crazy saga because his Super Bowl ring was stolen by Putin or something.
Was it really? Oh no, I think it was Kraft.
Oh, is it Kraft? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, right. You're right.
Yeah.
I screwed up my Patriots dynasty
And
luminaries.
then Kraft later, there was a whole thing with him and the madam from the rub and tug place that he went to, and is in the photo with Trump. So that's the next conspiracy they'll be working on.
Yeah, but so like on the cloudiness around the origin story of all this, it occurs to me that since there's so much we don't know, we're only really at the beginning of coming to terms with the enormity of the story. So Mueller issuing his conclusion, last weekend is by no means anywhere even near the culmination because there's still so many, pages to fill in.
Well, that's one of the things that made me suspicious. I'm going to look this up right now. Hang on a second.
Matt just whipped out his iPhone. Breaching in a breach of podcast etiquette.
Is that a breach of podcast etiquette?
I have zero podcast etiquette.
Here we go. So John Brennan. Let's see.
Should I whistle for people?
Hang on. Okay. So Brennan just this week. He tweets out, while Trump campaign engagements with Russians were highly inappropriate, we need to accept Special Counsel Mueller's finding that evidence of criminality was not established. So here's a guy who just like a couple of weeks ago was promising that there were going to be indictments of family members and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But the rapidity with which a number of people who are key figures in this whole thing are suddenly ready to say, okay, well, I guess that's it. Let's pack up and go home. That makes me wonder a little bit because, as you say, I think there's still a lot of there. We need to find out what was the decision-making process throughout this time. What was really what was happening? How did they come to these conclusions? How did they make decisions like? There was a decision at one point where they decided not to defensively brief the Trump campaign, right? Like typically, if you have some kind of an intelligence problem in a presidential campaign, they would.
Wasn't it in part because he wanted to bring Mike Flynn with him to the briefing, if I remember? Because Chris Christie just put out a memoir where he was saying he strongly urged Trump not to have Mike Flynn at those meetings, and he said that like Mike Flynn misbehaved at one of these briefings, or behaved in a way that the briefers didn't like.
Right.
And I think that might have contributed to the movement around this issue, because that would have been in the same time period, summer 2016, after he formally because Trump wrapped up the nomination officially in late July, or mid-July, right?
Right.
Meaning the convention was in mid-July when he was officially the nominee.
Right.
And that's when you start getting the briefings.
Yeah, no, there was some kind of a National Security Council meeting right around that time, but I don't know. I shouldn't speak, not having the information in front of me. But there's just a lot we don't know about what happened during this entire thing, and who talked to who, and how this all got started. And I think it would be another error piled on top of the ones we've already had if once the Mueller report is released, there's just sort of a brief period of freaking out, and then that's it. I think we have to go back and kind of do an autopsy on all this and follow up what happened and how this happened and why it happened, and do basically what the Brits did with the Chilcot report and that sort of thing.
Which of course won't happen.
Well, it won't happen. Well, it could happen.
It could. I mean, I don't know, because I guess if Trump is presiding over, maybe he'll force their hand.
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely there are people in the Senate who definitely want to go there, and in the House. So,
well, another thing on Brennan that occurs to me now, it is just fundamentally strange that John Brennan is an active Twitter user, because the entire media is tethered to Twitter all day. That's how they program cable news.
Right.
Whatever's trending, whatever the big viral scoop is, and you have John Brennan who's like loudly tweeting proclamations of treason constantly about Trump, which colors the entire media perception, because those tweets, of course, become viral if the former head of the CIA is making such a dramatic claim about the sitting president.
Right. Yeah. No.
It's automatically in your feed, and that's what happened after the Helsinki summit. when he made his most kind of fervent declaration that Trump was obviously engaging in treasonous behavior with Putin because he made some kind of offhand stupid comment that ultimately had no real significance other than he was just kind of, I guess, maybe mildly flattering Putin at that press conference. People extrapolated so wildly from what that meant.
Oh my God!
But it's because Brennan has such a active role in how the media, looked at this entire thing.
Yeah, no, and the sudden appearance on Twitter of all these figures,
Comey,
Clapper, John Cipher.
Yeah.
What a perfect name, right? For
Susan Hennessy, who's she was an NSA lawyer,
right? Yeah.
Now is like the chief expert consulted by MSN, but I guess she's on CNN, whatever network she happens to be on. It is CNN. It's like, why isn't it ever looked at that she obviously has vested interests by dint of her having served within the security state apparatus that's such a central player in this entire story? Nobody thinks about it.
Yeah, no, I mean, there was never any questioning of the genesis of the story, the internal rationale for it, what exactly they were looking for. Like the mandate for Mueller was so strange, like what does it mean to ask a special prosecutor to look for links?
Yeah.
Right? Like that was such a strange thing.
Like a meeting, like a link, they were saying a link was literally a handshake at a public event. That constituted a link. But
prosecutors are supposed to look for crimes, aren't they? Right. Like, that part of it was so strange, and this felt like it was going backwards. They were taking the people and the characters, and then looking for the illegal behavior that might have fit into the narrative. So.
This is why when I was on Sam Cedar's show yesterday, and it was a shit show, he was trying to get me to clarify whether I supported the investigation.
Right.
And the reason why I said I was agnostic was because given that mandate, which is so broad and doesn't seem to have any particular focus on a crime,
right.
It always seemed to me, since before the special counsel was launched, that it would end up just encompassing all kinds of weird conspiratorial angles that seemed like it would not be necessarily a healthy thing to have for 2+ years or whatever.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. And by the time the Mueller investigation happened, I thought I knew for sure something was off about it, because if they were going to have an investigation, if they should have had it before Trump was inaugurated.
Right.
They should have put everything on the table at that point, and they should have had a bipartisan, some kind of commission.
Yeah. Bring in some elder statesmen to run it.
Exactly, and do it so that there wouldn't be a cloud hanging over the next president of the United States. Instead, the Mueller investigation is technically a continuation of an investigation whose existence we didn't even know of.
Yeah.
Until, what was it, March of...
Yeah, when Comey did that dramatic testimony. Remember when all of Washington stood still and tuned in?
Yeah, exactly. And so then we find out that there is this investigation that goes back all the way to the middle of the previous year. And so... and we don't know anything about the origins of that. Right. So do I support that? I don't know, because I don't know what it was about.
Yeah, we're at such an information deficit that I can't say whether I support it, which is why what I said to Sam was agnostic.
Right.
But he took that as that I was trying to evade the subject or whatever. It was just very strange interacting with people who obviously haven't followed this story day in and day out like we have. And if you're immersed in the details, you can't avoid this feeling that there was just always something that seemed elementally wrong with it.
Right. And look, I have to admit, I felt a lot like that scene in Annie Hall, where Woody Allen is talking about the third gunman and everything and the JFK assassination.
I don't remember. I mean, I saw that years ago, and my memory is wired where I can't recall scenes in movies that I saw more than 3 years ago. I don't know what it is, but...
Basically, it's about someone who gets way too obsessed about something. I felt like that a lot with the story.
Me too.
I'm way too invested in this thing, and part of it was because I was taking a lot of, shit for it, and And I thought I was crazy,
Yeah.
and I couldn't figure it out. Like that was the other part of it that was driving me nuts. Was normally, and I'm still in a place where I don't think I have a good handle. I mean, I have some guesses about what went on there, but
Right.
but a lot of the facts that were coming out and the information just didn't add up in any way that made a whole lot of sense to me, and so I became very like obsessed with reading all the minutia and going through all the testimony and everything, and I'm sure I drove everybody and my wife and my family members crazy about some of this, but that's what happens, I mean, I guess when you get locked into a story like this, you have to try to fight your way out of it. This one is just so complicated that it was just hard to get hold of.
Part of the reason why I've been on such a frenetic rampage against a lot of media quote colleagues over the past week or so is because there are a lot of people now posturing as skeptics all along. They never bought into it. They were indifferent. They had this sense of detachment from it.
Yeah, really?
Yeah, it's like, really? So why didn't you say anything? I mean, You had almost 3 years.
Right.
But now they want to kind of poo-poo the so-called skeptics who are, quote, vindicated and say, oh, we knew it all along. Yeah, we never said anything and we deserve some kind of credit too. I guess it's just like, no, if you weren't called an agent of Russia, if you weren't accused of being a traitor during this time period, then you weren't a skeptic. Let's put it that way. A traitorous defender of Trump.
Right, yeah, exactly. Both of those things.
Yeah.
Which to people became simultaneous, synonymous.
Yeah, but now there's like this pose among like this crowd of, cool kid journos in Brooklyn or whatever. I know that's an oversimplification, and I actually have lived in Brooklyn, so I don't want to denounce an entire borough, but It's just like there's this weird attitude where they're almost above it all, and they resent the fact that anybody's getting credit, when it's just like we've gone over the psychological toll that this inflicted and the reputational and social consequences. So like if you didn't incur any of that, if you took zero risk at all at any point, then why do you have this high and mighty attitude? It just really rubs me the wrong way.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough. I'm less about the score settling at this point than I am about, I mean, there were people who really had a tough time during this period, and I don't know. It was good that Glenn, for instance, would jump in and deflect or take on criticism. He was happy to take all the shit for anybody who felt like saying anything about this during this time period.
Yeah.
But there were a lot of people who didn't do that, and and there were people who worked for big networks and didn't have anybody on. Like, I'm not necessarily saying they should have had me on, but they should have had somebody on.
Right.
It would have been great television to have Glenn on, for instance. I just don't understand why they wouldn't do that.
Yeah, and me and Glenn get criticized constantly because we get invited to go on Fox.
Right.
And it's just like, what other platform is available to express these principled beliefs that we have about the futility of this entire enterprise? I mean, if there was an opportunity brought before us, then we would take it.
Right, yeah.
But it's just not there, so you're going to say that going on Fox is somehow intrinsically evil. Well, is it evil per that calculus that there's no opening at all on any of the other platforms for this?
Right, and this just gets back to what I was talking about before, where we have this cleaved media system where if there's a problem, or if there's an inconsistency, you can't talk about it in the original platform. You can only talk about, again, it's the Daily Caller that does the fact checking, right? And so the Daily Caller ends up doing really good work during this period, right? And,
the Federalist did some good work.
Yeah, exactly. Was it the Epoch Times or whatever it is? I don't know what they are, but that was the only place where you could put any of this information, or you can find any of it. I mean, there was a thing when Christopher Steele testified or gave that submission to the court in early 2017.
In the UK.
In the UK, yeah, where he talked about how his report was raw and unverified, or needed to be verified. And the only place it came out in the United States was in the Washington Times. And at first I thought, well, if I link to the Washington Times, people are going to say, oh, it's the Washington Times, or, you know, blah, blah, and they're going to ignore it. So then I thought I'd try to find the document. I called up the court in Britain and everything. But then I thought, well, that's not right. You know, they did the work. You know, and so that was a constant problem during this entire time period. It would have been great if CNN or CBS or ABC or any of these channels had offered the opportunity for somebody to come on and explore, just even to talk about the possibility that there was some other interpretation of events, but it just didn't happen. We only had two types of media during this time period. There were two takes. Mm-hmm. There was he didn't do it at all, and he's guilty of everything and is going to jail forever. That was it. And you know, there's space in between for something. There should be.
And that's why media people, I think, are so resistant to any reckoning. It's because, by and large, the conservative media got this right. Not totally. Right. You know, a lot of times they ran with kind of oversimplified partisan version of the story where like Mueller was just a Democratic witch hunt or something. And Trump himself would use that phrase, which is just not right. Right. It was more like an institutional security state move against him rather than anything that was inflected by a partisan motive. Right, yeah. But liberals in the media, or even leftists, you know, go down the list, they don't want to acknowledge that the conservatives, you know, outperform them. Right, right. Well, you know, they had truth on their side on a lot of the stuff. I mean, and I'm sure the countervailing argument here will be, well, think about all the things that they uncovered, the Manafort's improprieties, and you know, all the things that Mueller found out about the Internet Research Agency. Although that stuff, again, it's just an indictment; it hasn't been proven out. Right. But no, I think you're right. I mean, again, I feel like Chuck Ross was the best reporter on a lot of this stuff, which is kind of embarrassing, you know. And you know, that's not a good thing. I think the New York Times people, you know, after Scott Shane did that story about the new knowledge thing, I mean, how did they not suddenly, you know, send a whole team of people into that whole topic, you know? I mean, there was like an incuriosity there that, right? It's hard to explain. Right, the Integrity Initiative stuff that happened in England, you know, you know, that whole sort of infrastructure of, you know, the Atlantic Council, Proper Not, New Knowledge, all these sort of anti-Russian, you know, quasi-state-sponsored things that sort of popped up out of nowhere and became, you know, sources for a lot of the big headlines. Like if you looked at all those New York Times stories about how the bots were influencing, I don't know, the Parkland shooting or whatever it was, right? If you look down in a couple of paragraphs, it was always New Knowledge or Hamilton 68 or something like that. Where were the stories about who the hell are these people? And you know, how long have these organizations been around, and how did they coalesce? Who's funding them? Who's funding them? You know, why should we be, you know, paying attention to this group of people? And you know, when you looked on the list of names, I don't know, it was very curious that the whole thing about the Atlantic Council advising Facebook to delete, you know, these sort of small alternative sites and everything. Like it was just, there's so many bizarre little threads that nobody picked at. It was very strange. Yeah. And you know what I also think is going to be a huge factor in why the media is going to so resist any thorough audit or self-reflection? It's because Trump himself whether you like it or not, he himself was correct in how he characterized a lot of what went on.
Of course, and he completely baited the media into doing. I mean, look, I was there when he started making us part of his act, you know, and it was incredibly.
So was I.
Were you?
Well, I mean, I went to a bunch of the rallies and stuff.
Went to the rallies, yeah. And it was so transparent that he started to smell this tremendous opportunity with us, you know.
Right.
Maybe it was just the fact that he dealt with a lot of reporters over the years, but seeing us in these groups, right, and seeing how crowds reacted to us, especially conservative crowds, he could see that this group of people, if all I have to do is triangulate against them, and I'm just going to get vote after vote after vote. And
he didn't just deal with reporters. He was in the mothership. He was at NBC.
Right. No, of course. Yeah. But it's a different kind of thing to see them in packs.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Well, that's why when I went to Trump rallies, I would never go in the media section. Right. I just went in the general admission section.
Right.
I feel dirty going in with these like media snobs, essentially.
But see, even you saying that, he picked up on that beautifully, right? That people feel that way about reporters, you know, and they literally stand above the rest of the crowd on their ridiculous risers, and they've got a million lanyards on, you know, which signals,
they all look like bookish people from Park Slope or something.
Yeah, exactly, and they've got. You know, a lot of them have the sort of Operation Iraqi Freedom lanyard holder or whatever it is. You know, look, I was in the wars. You know, that kind of thing.
They put like the campaign stickers from all the various like presidential campaigns on their laptop.
Yeah. Oh yeah, totally. Like, you know, I've been everywhere. I'm world weary.
I'm a vet.
Yeah, exactly. And look, that shit just doesn't play. It doesn't. Like, you know,
nobody gives a shit.
Nobody gives a shit. And as a reporter, you have to understand, you know, it's a lose-lose situation because you have to do the story, and especially the people who are there for TV, they got to be on those risers. There's no place else they can be, right? Yeah. But we look like idiots. We just do, you know. And Trump.
But if you're like a magazine reporter or reporting from some online outlet, you don't have to go on the riser. I didn't. I got in.
You don't have to. No, that's true.
It's like if you have a certain outlook.
Right.
Then you don't necessarily have to be implicated by the Trump criticism. You can do something else, but the reporters are so in this kind of collective mentality.
That's true. In their defense, I will say that later in the campaign, once the Secret Service gets involved, you can't really just freely leave the bubble. Like, there are rules about that.
But you can get a general admission ticket and just wait online with the public and get in.
You can, but if you're traveling on the plane,
right? That's right. That's true.
So you're supposed to kind of stick with the group.
I was never on the planes. That was never a logistical concern for me.
But either way, the separateness of it, you know, the fact having us all in one place, and it was in the middle of the event, right? Which is annoying in its own right. It's like, imagine if you're watching a baseball game and there's a bunch of people who are like standing in front of you, you know, in the middle of your section, so you can't see the game. Like we were just the biggest assholes.
Yeah. This is where the professional wrestling element comes in, right? It's almost as if like Trump should have come out on stage to the Stone Cold Steve Austin music with the glass crashing, and like the crowd goes wild, and then he has a heel right in front of him.
Yeah. No. That's exactly what he was doing. Look at these bloodsuckers, you know, like that. And it was, you know.
Sick puppies.
Yeah, no, and I mean, it was not fun, but I could see right away, like, this is gonna work, right? Yeah. And now, what he did, and reporters took it way too personally. Yeah. Like they should have realized, okay,
it's a performance.
It's a performance, exactly. Like, you know, and not that he doesn't completely insult us all the time, and even egg people on to maybe, you know, confront us physically and you know, denigrate the free press in a way that no president ever should. Like, look, I get all that.
Feuding with Jim Acosta is not a genuine threat to press freedom.
It isn't. And look, Jim Acosta was basically just doing the same thing that Trump was doing, but for ratings. But we should, like, the way a real reporter, can you imagine Seymour Hersh overreacting and flapping his arms like, oh my God, you've insulted the dignity of journalism? He'd be laughing at all that shit, right? Yeah. Like, like, look.
I.F. Stone going on this like melodramatic, emotional rant about how offended he is that the president said something mean about him.
Right, yeah, but look, it's a guy who was trying to get votes, and he was making a decision that turned out to be a pretty good business decision.
Again, it's one thing if he does something that genuinely threatens press freedom.
Right.
It's another if he's just doing shit talking.
Right, yeah. And yanking Jim Acosta's, White House credential, like,
who cares?
Who cares? We should be...
Shouldn't even be going in the first place. It's useless.
And I mean, I remember when this was an issue with Bush, during the Bush years, there was this whole thing about how he wasn't calling on, I think it was Dana Milbank, or it was Mike White. I can't remember who it was, but Bush froze out the Washington Post for a little while because they were asking the wrong questions or were asking tough questions about something. And everybody was hooting and hollering, oh, how can you do this? You're freezing us out. You're not listening. Well, so what? You're adversaries, right? Like, you're supposed to be outside the tent. And there was a huge controversy about the fact that he went on this Thanksgiving trip to Iraq.
That I remember.
And didn't invite everybody.
Yeah.
Right? Like, you didn't invite us on your secret trip to, like...
And, like, photos came out after the fact of him posing with a turkey or something.
The turkey, yeah, exactly. And everybody was mad. Like, because we've come to expect that we are part of this sort of, like, inner circle, we're behind the rope line with the president, and, how dare you take us out of our privileged spot. But we shouldn't care about that. Like, that part of it should, that we should be just fine not having that privileged spot.
I notice how you speak of, like, fellow journalists with the royal we. Like, you consider yourself in some kind of just intrinsic cohort with them. I'm at the point where I have such disdain for almost all of them that I almost even don't conceive of my role in that way. Yeah. I mean, it's a rhetorical choice. Yeah.
Because
like, you want to encourage their best instincts.
Right. Yeah, no, definitely. Also, you want to take some responsibility for being part of it, right? I mean, if
you're part of an institution, broadly construed,
part of an institution, and on some level, if they're doing something that means that I maybe haven't haven't done enough to, I got things wrong, on with Trump's campaign. I completely screwed up the general election and made a real rookie mistake there and totally
screwed up, meaning that you assumed they would lose.
Yeah,
at a certain point.
I was going to these events that were just jam packed with people, and this was even after the Access Hollywood thing, and then I didn't cover Hillary, so I didn't go to her events, but I was hearing from people who were. And they were like, man, she can't even fill a hall with like 3,000 people in it. And so
I remember going to a Hillary event during the primaries where, part of the people introducing her was in New Jersey, actually. So it was like one of the last primaries. And one of the local politicians introducing her, I think I remember who it was, but I don't want to say just in case, basically launched into this attack on how Bernie needed to get out of the race. And it's just like, so they're prolonging the fissures within the party at a very late point in the primary process, which was one of many indicators to me that the tension within the Democratic coalition was probably even worse for Hillary than whatever tension existed in the Republican coalition was for Trump. And that's part of what led me to assume that Trump had a much, much better chance of winning than most people understood.
Right. Yeah.
Because the dissension within the Democratic Party was intentionally underplayed by the media because they were doing everything they could to help to defeat Trump.
Right.
So they wouldn't give any attention to this obvious fracturing that was going on, and came to a head of the Democratic Convention, which was the most raucous since 1968.
Right. Yeah. No, they were completely playing down that aspect of it, and I think that contributed to some of the enthusiasm for this Russia story, because the notion that the leaks, like which blew up during the convention, and created this a lot of the anger from the Bernie crowd, right? Because they were reading the emails and everything. There were
the entire DNC executive committee resigned in disgrace on the eve of the convention.
Yeah, exactly, that whole thing. So the leaking of the true emails, right? I think a lot of people felt like, it undermined the harmonious image that otherwise might have emerged. And there might be something to that, but we don't know exactly what the provenance of that was. But you're right. There were indicators that there were certainly indicators that there were problems with the Democratic campaign that were ignored, and on the Trump side, I thought he had lost his thread a little bit after the convention. Like, his convention speech was very on him. Like, he doesn't do well when he's reading prepared remarks.
He should have just done like a wild extemporaneous rant instead of a prepared speech.
Yeah, it would have maybe that would have been better. But I fell into the trap of listening to pollsters and listening to conventional wisdom.
Nate Silver became your guru.
Yeah, no, I did. I fell for that shit, and I'm really embarrassed to go back and.
I did not, and that also made me the subject of a huge amount of hostility at the time, because by simply applying your dispassionate analysis, which I did, that was also excusing Trump or whatever, trying to bolster Trump when it wasn't. Another thing that I'm thinking back now that really gave me insight into why I thought that he was always far more likely to win than people assumed, was that there was polling data that you could look at that was isolated to Maine, where they allocate their electoral votes by congressional district, and Trump consistently was polling either ahead or he was always tied or ahead with Hillary in that district, and the lead kept growing. And it's a very white, downscale, quote unquote, district,
right? With
a rural. It's very rural. It's like the northern portion of Maine, so not Portland,
right?
And Trump was doing far more well than Romney in that particular district. I'm like, okay, whatever demographics are responding to him there are replicable elsewhere,
right?
And are actually in electorally advantageous states primarily, like Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. So that was always like the prism for me for understanding why I think his support was broader,
right,
than most, like the Nate Silver people of the world thought, because Nate wasn't. I actually kind of like Nate, frankly. He's kind of got a sassy side to him, and he has some good insights. But yeah, on that story, he was just way smug.
But yeah, to his credit, he later said, "I let punditry affect my prognostication," which was true. That's the kind of thing that has to happen now. You know what I mean?
Right. But so it didn't happen after 2016.
Right.
It's not going to happen now.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No. And the surviving legend, like there was another early clue I got that something was going on with the media that was new, which was I quoted somebody in a Trump story who had been a union member who was from Wisconsin. And the guy basically said something like, yeah, I grew up in a family of union members who voted Democratic, and after NAFTA, he basically was like, fuck the Democrats, I'm not going to vote for them. And so all I did was quote the guy. I didn't even really, elaborate on it at all. And there was like a little bit of a social media backlash to all that.
Yeah.
Like the whole idea of entertaining the economic anxiety thing. And I thought, well, this is a true thing that happened. Like, what's the issue here? Was I supposed to not put the person in the piece? Like, what's the idea, And this whole thing about leaving out the class aspect of the story, which was so incredibly powerful and obvious, that in favor of making it 100% about race. That told me that there was something going on with the press, that they were trying to overlay a narrative on top of what had actually happened.
Now that you mentioned that, another indicator for me that Trump, I thought, was far more likely to win was that I kept hearing from union guys like that they were struck at how much support he had within, largely white, granted, union organizations.
Right.
So I got my hands, I got a copy of the National Teamsters election guide from 2016. Mm-hmm. Now the Teamsters technically had endorsed Hillary. Mm-hmm. Like the leadership, they're Democrats. So they endorsed the Democratic nominee. But if you went and looked through the voter guide that they sent out, that went to all the membership, Hillary was buried. I mean, they emphasized their other endorsements, like on the Senate congressional level, but there was almost very little mention of Hillary at all.
Right.
Because there was a lot of internal strife about the fact that almost seemingly an unprecedented percentage of the membership were actually supporting Trump.
Right.
And they didn't want to highlight that fact, but it was real, and it contributed to the win for sure.
Right. Interesting. I gotta go to a birthday party.
Okay, yeah. Okay, let's wrap up. One last thing, just to finish. We went on this digression about the 2016 election, was really interesting. But the one last thing I keep thinking about, and I spoke to Glenn about recently, is that there really was the makings of what you might call a coup that is associated with the Trump-Russia story.
Yeah.
It was like an attempted coup. I know that sounds hyperbolic, and the coup didn't, quote, succeed, but you had all the senior-most law enforcement officials in the country basically colluding, to use that word, to thwart the will of the electorate. I mean, Brennan, Comey, McCabe, Strzok, Page. You had this guy, Stephen Halper, basically trying to infiltrate the campaign. All this stuff, and it's just like, if this has happened in Egypt or something, or some far-flung, Eastern European country, we would be calling it a coup attempt. Rod Rosenstein and McCabe contemplated, quote, wearing a wire on Trump in the White House.
Yeah, I know.
That's insane.
And the most recent thing that came out on that front about McCabe and the starting of the investigation.
Well, the reason why that they suspected that he was he was a national security threat was because he was suspiciously in line with the priorities of Russia. So they were like criminalizing his foreign policy priorities. Because McCabe, when he was asked about it on his never-ending book tour, he basically said that it was sort of a confluence of factors which led him to launch that investigation, one of which was this perception that Trump may have had the interests of Russia at heart and was enacting policies to that effect.
Right. And
even though he didn't enact any such policies, he's been hawkish on Russia.
I can theoretically understand the possibility of maybe thinking that in reaction to the firing of Comey, although frankly, I would have fired all four of those motherfuckers after they delivered the Steele report, because that was so transparently like a J. Edgar Hoover style power play. But whatever. The later thing with this McCabe investigation, and essentially what it comes down to, in the stories that I read, was they just felt that he was too close to Russia. There was no specific crime. There was
not even any privileged information that they claimed that they had, which was the basis for that suspicion.
Right. Yeah,
it was all them just reacting to public events and reading the media.
So who has the authority to secretly open up an investigation against, the president? I mean, I know it's Trump, but people should.
Doesn't matter.
This was one of about a dozen things that should have worried people. That would worry people if it had been any other president, like the raid of Cohen. Right?
Yeah.
Like, I have a friend who's a drug dealer, right? And he's like, when I saw that shit, I thought to myself, they can do that to the president, they can do that to my lawyer, you know? And there were a number of things like that happened throughout this, but that was the most serious thing. This whole idea that, you know, you can have unilaterally people sort of inside the government deciding to investigate the president based on just not liking his attitude on, you know, on foreign policy, basically. That's what it came down to. I think the standard has to be much clearer and much higher than that, you know? And the whole 25th Amendment thing.
You can't be criminalizing political differences.
Right, yeah, exactly.
Otherwise, it's like a rogue security state.
Right.
That is supposed to be like totally inimical to how the American system functions.
Right. Now, I say that with the caveat that we still don't know what's at the beginning of the original FBI investigation. Maybe there's some factoid in there that we still don't know after all this time that would justify that kind of response. I mean, I think it's unlikely, but that's possible. But you're absolutely right. That was a big story that got almost no play.
I was telling, you know, quote, progressives that now we have a precedent with a C enshrined,
right,
where this could happen to President Bernie theoretically, and you're not caring now makes that eventuality more likely.
Right. If you're thinking about it in terms of if this had happened 10 years ago with Barack Obama, can you imagine? Can you imagine what the response would have been if, you know, because Barack Obama's, I mean, this is another thing that people haven't thought about. Barack Obama's policies vis-a-vis Russia, especially Iran, Syria, you know, they don't differ a whole lot from the things that Donald Trump was saying on the campaign trail that was bothering people so much. There was a profound difference between Obama and people like Ashton Carter and Hillary and, you know, all those hawks, John McCain. And, you know, you can imagine a situation where people would say the president is just, you know, not.
He's compromised.
He's compromised, and now we have this, exactly as you say, we have a precedent out there. And the other thing that drives me crazy that people don't realize, and you have to live in a third world country to understand this, but this concept of permanent criminal investigations by the opposition of the executive, it's just something that's normal in fucked up states, right? And now this is going to be a permanent feature of our lives now, right? No, granted, this might have started with Whitewater. Right? You could theoretically go back in time and blame it on.
But the scale was such smaller that it almost doesn't seem relevant. You know?
No, that's true, because this thing was blown out into
and there was nothing like this under Obama for the full 8 years.
That's true. That's true. But if this now becomes institutionalized, and we have, you know, whoever comes in power, their legitimacy is going to be questioned immediately. Like this is a thing that could happen, you know? And
that's why, and this is like literally the last point, but that's why I tend to kind of put all this in the context of just a receding empire in a way. It seems like something that you would expect to happen in a superpower that is slowly and kind of ineluctably losing its standing.
Right.
It's kind of like a paranoid outburst that runs, you know, concomitant with that.
Yeah, no, and people will blame this on Trump, but Trump was really the symptom here. He was not the cause. Like Trump only gets into office because of a total collapse in confidence in the system. The system is already cracking by the time, you know, he comes along and runs for president. And then he gets in, and we have all these sort of extra democratic things that start happening almost immediately, which is ironic because the fear was that he was going to be the destroyer of democracy.
The norm violator.
Yeah, the norm violator. And he didn't, you know, he has violated some norms. Let's be clear about that.
Nothing as dramatic as this, though.
Nothing as dramatic as this. So, you know, I think that was a big story, and that's why, you know, when we talk about going back and sort of starting over and looking at this with fresh eyes, just dispassionately what happened during this time period. That whole thing with, beginning with the origin of the investigation through the McCabe thing, through the wearing the wire incident with Rosenstein, we got to look at that seriously. Like, what the fuck happened there? Like, was that, was that as bad as it looked, or is it?
That was another instance where I felt like I was going crazy because I was reading this news and I was like, what am I seeing here, and why isn't there a reaction that seems to be proportionate with what is being revealed?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I have a friend who works in the media, let's say.
Shall go unnamed.
Yeah, shall go unnamed. And when the McCabe thing happened, called me up that night and basically was like sort of weeping into my shoulder, saying, am I losing my mind? Like that was basically like a coup attempt, and
Yeah.
apparently they'd had a meeting and
Because remember, McCabe was running the FBI at the time.
Yeah, he was running the FBI
and Rosenstein was effectively running the Department of Justice.
Right. Yeah. So
literally the two senior most officials in the entire federal law enforcement apparatus.
Right. So they're getting together and making these decisions, which under almost any other circumstance, if there was any other president, there would be a massive national outcry about it. But because it's Trump, and again, there's nothing you can do to Trump that will offend people. You can, and that maybe he deserves that. I get it. You can do a cartoon that's literally, you can't think of a cartoon that's too disgusting to do to Trump. I mean, look, even one of our stories, I had Trump's head coming out of the ass of a donkey or something like that. I mean, but people are so intense about how horrible he was that they forgot that all kinds of bizarre, like, new frontiers were being broken legally during this time period. Beginning with the investigation, there's some stuff going on with surveillance that we don't 100% understand here.
Right, like how was FISA used exactly?
Yeah, exactly. Like did
Carter Page really merit the surveillance that he was subjected to? It seems likely not.
Yeah, it seems very likely not. There were some things that were.
Carter Page should actually probably get compensated for all he's been through, frankly.
Yeah, no, and the sort of idea of having somebody under secret surveillance and then trying to have them testify, under oath. I mean, that's like a trick straight out of the HUAC years, right? I mean, yeah. I don't know. I think there's a lot of stuff there that would have bothered people, of sort of the ACLU ilk. Years ago, if the president had been different. But, because this story is what it is, and people still have hopes that it's going to end their Trump nightmare, they just can't see it yet. I think they will down the road. I'm hoping,
And did the media guy that called you that night and was like weeping into your shoulder or whatever, or did he or she feel guilty, or what was the emotional response?
No, I mean, like, I have a couple of friends who were in very, very difficult positions, mm-hmm. who have kids, who were often put on the spot, and had to try where they could to kind of slow the train down a little bit, or at least introduce the thought that maybe we should think about this or that. But most of the people I knew in the business who had reservations just kept quiet about it. And
I mean, I know if you have kids, I mean, I get it, but ultimately that's cowardice.
Yeah, no, it is. I mean, look, it's tough. I mean, it's when you have kids, and
this is why I'll be forever childless.
Yeah,
I guess.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you make decisions that you wouldn't make, and I've got kids, but this was a tough one, and there were some pretty prominent journalists too who it wasn't that they completely, jumped on the bandwagon, but they kind of stayed to the sidelines a little bit more than you would have thought. I mean, I think Bob Woodward that sort of offhand comment, like, "Oh yeah, I looked for collusion, didn't find it."
Didn't find anything. It's like, what? Can you restate that, please?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I looked pretty hard, and didn't find it. That comes out once in like an interview with Hugh Hewitt, and I don't know.
But his book sold like 50 million copies anyways.
Right,
it wasn't if he
exactly.
paid any price for not divulging that.
Right. And that's the whole thing. Is it's a lot of it's about will you ever get the invitations back to be able to plug your stuff on the cable networks or on HBO or whatever it is, and I don't know. I mean, this was a tough period for a lot of people in journalism, and I hope that that in the future, at least, that it becomes a lesson that that if we have real concerns about stories, that it should be okay. We should at least encourage people to like come forward about it, right? Because this was a period when people became nervous about even saying things out loud in their offices, which is not a good state to be in, especially not in journalism. Like, journalism is a thing where it used to be normal to toss around just any idea, and now in this culture, people are afraid to be that person. They don't want to wear the the scarlet letter of being a denialist or whatever the fuck the word is. There's so many like words for unorthodoxy now.
Apologists.
Whataboutists. The false
Russian
equivalenters. Yeah, exactly. Putin bots. Anyway, it's craziness.
Well, yeah, it has been tough. It may yet get tougher. We'll have to see.
Yeah, definitely.
Matt, this was fantastic. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks, and good to see you. Thanks for coming to my home.
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
Understated.
Understated. This is my office, actually.
Yeah.
So,
all righty,
man.
Bye.
Excellent.
Well, there you have it. I felt like I needed a cigarette after that conversation, frankly, and I do not smoke. Please give me your feedback, suggestions, comments, complaints, trolling attempts, whatever. Subscribe on Patreon and YouTube. Individual contributions can be made via PayPal, if that's your preference. And I'll see you next time.